Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about the witch trials. In part 1, A Book of Blood, we will talk about how early Christianity and pagan magic coexisted uneasily for hundreds of years before more and more people began to actively fear sorcery. A man named Heinrich Kramer fanned the flames of terror by writing a book called Malleus Maleficarum, which would become a guide for the persecution of witches. From the beginning, monotheists in the West found themselves at odds with their pagan neighbors over a number of issues. Hebrews worshipped a single deity called He, while many pagans worshipped nature goddesses. Such pagans also freely used magic, while the Old Testament prohibited omens, divination, and communing with demons. The Old Testament also provided methods of punishment and execution for those found guilty of using black magic. Despite this harsh condemnation, pagan wise women retained some standing among the ancient Hebrews. King Saul himself is said to have consulted wise women before a great battle. They predicted his death in combat, which came true. Early Christians inherited this belief in magic, but the early church did not consider it a pressing matter. Indeed, early Christianity, especially in the post-Roman world, could be described as a syncretic faith. It combined Christian worship with veneration of older gods. Priests during the early Middle Ages competed with these old gods and forest spirits for the devotion of their congregations. More than one priest expressed annoyance at peasants making offerings to gods in the forest, then pleading poverty when the church came for its tithes. Even by the Middle Ages, many people throughout Europe still believed in spirits, magic, herbal remedies, and left offerings to forest and river spirits, all holdovers from the pagan era. In an almost modern sensibility, the medieval church condemned this belief in magic and demons as mere superstition, best ignored. That did not stop some priests from using holy water mixed with milk and grain to bless fields and bring fertility, likely to comfort their congregations. However, women's roles clearly set Christianity apart from paganism. Old pagan religions included goddesses in their pantheon, with priestesses leading worship. The church, first Catholic and then Protestant, was very much a man's world. It would be a mistake, of course, to see paganism as liberating women and Christianity as subjugating them, but paganism did allow for women to play a greater role in religious activities than was typically allowed in the medieval church, something that made the Christian clergy less than comfortable. Indeed, women continued to lead semi-pagan activities like herbalism, divination, and spellcraft. Despite ongoing skepticism within the church about magic, something changed even before the catastrophes of the 1300s. In 1258, Pope Alexander IV accepted that communion with demons would be tantamount to heresy. St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote about the same time, also stated that consulting or bargaining with demons should be considered apostasy. When the church moved to eliminate the Knights Templar in 1306, they used charges of witchcraft and devil worship when they brought the knights to court. Yet, until then, the specter of witchery and witch trials did not affect the average person. That changed during the Great Famine of the 1310s and the Black Death of the 1340s, when many Christians became willing to believe in satanic conspiracies that wished to annihilate Christendom. An elaborate popular mythology began to develop around witches. People believed that they flew on brooms, attended witches' sabbaths, took off their clothes and danced under the moon, and engaged in gluttonous feasts upon the flesh of infants. The feast reached its climax when Satan himself appeared and had intercourse with all of the witches. However, it would be a man operating wholly outside papal authority who put a hammer into the hands of the witch hunters. Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican monk who specialized in the inquisition of witchcraft, first burst into the historical record in the year 1484. That year, the German town of Ravensburg suffered a demonic hailstorm that ruined their crops. In the hysteria that followed, townspeople accused 8 women of witchcraft. Those women faced a delegation of local officials assisted by Kramer. They accused them of conjuring a violent storm that ruined the crops around Ravensburg. To get their confession, Kramer bound their wrists to ropes and pulled them until he dislocated their shoulders. 2 of the women confessed to conjuring storms, and Kramer burned them alive. A year later, Kramer arrived in Innsbruck to assist in the prosecution of 48 women and 2 men accused of witchcraft. Kramer took command of the trial and began to ask one of the women intimate questions about her romantic life. He seemed especially interested in whether or not she had relations with a demon. A lawyer sent by the local bishop objected to the inquisitor's behavior and sent him away. In time, the accused would be found innocent and released. Kramer remained in Innsbruck for a time, badgering women with similar questions. In the end, it took a letter from the bishop to make Kramer leave the Innsbruck women in peace. However, Kramer fumed about his humiliation. Soon after, he began writing one of the most infamous books in history to vindicate himself and his methods, and prove that a vast network of covens worked to bring down Christendom. Within a year, he wrote 256 pages of dense Latin titled Malleus Maleficarum, meaning Hammer of the Witches. It was a guidebook for locating and prosecuting witches. In it, he vividly described their supposed nefarious activities. He claimed they gained access to men's thoughts, spread diseases, kidnapped and sacrificed children, drank blood, ate human flesh, and conjured storms to sink ships and ruin crops. Before the Maleficarum, many within the church questioned the very existence of witches, or if they did exist, did they pose a real threat? To help sell this danger, Kramer claimed that Satan tempted mere mortals with earthly powers in exchange for doing his bidding. He further claimed that women, because of their supposed lustful appetites inherited from Eve, would be especially susceptible to temptation. Indeed, Kramer wrote, "Lusting is insatiable in them, and for this reason they cavort with demons." In short, he provided a systematic argument for the existence of witches, and during an age of famine and war, people became all the more willing to believe such claims. Kramer divided his book into 3 parts to help sell the idea that a continent-spanning conspiracy of women had bound themselves to Satan. The first section provided a detailed explanation as to why witches existed. Second, Kramer gave clerics and secular authorities a guide for finding out who was a witch and who was not. His third and most infamous part provided a practical handbook for the accusation, prosecution, and punishment of witches. Kramer described this as exterminating them through due justice. Because of this section, even a woman of sound mind and strong scholarship would be hard-pressed against well-prepared attorneys. However, Kramer also used scandal to sell his book. He obsessed over women's supposed lustfulness and gave graphic description of them indulging their appetites with demons. This fed into the casual misogyny of the day, as well as providing titillation for a largely male audience. Indeed, Kramer himself obsessed over such things, viewing any such activity by women as evidence of witchery. But why were so many men willing to believe Kramer? After the population crash caused by the Black Death, women left the home to work in business and skilled trades. However, by Kramer's time, the population had stabilized, and men began pushing women out of the public sphere and back into the kitchen. At a time when many men feared and despised the gains women made during the 1300s, they readily believed Kramer's tales. To give his book greater authority, Kramer included a papal bull in his book, which all but made it official church doctrine. The bull warned against witches and their nefarious role in sickening people and livestock. It also gave authority to Kramer to hunt them down and punish them. However, the papal bull's date of publication came almost 3 years before the writing of Maleficarum. Most likely, Kramer obtained the papal bull by asking for the authority to force greater cooperation with his witch hunts, and probably provided a substantial bribe to get it. He mentioned neither of these in his book. In short, Kramer misused a papal bull to manipulate and mislead his audience. However, Kramer's falsehoods had not yet finished. He claimed to have written the book with the esteemed Professor Jacob Springer, yet there is no evidence that Springer had any such role. Kramer also sought an approbation or endorsement from the University of Cologne. It is worth noting that many at the time would have found the idea that witches represented the highest heresy to be very odd, and many wondered how a crank like Kramer won the endorsement of the faculty of the University of Cologne, where Springer taught. Most likely, Kramer earned it by forging the signatures on the approbation. Only one senior professor read the book in its entirety, and he found it disturbing, problematic, and even dangerous. Armed with a likely falsified university approbation and a misleading papal bull, Kramer sent his venomous book to the presses, publishing it in the town of Speyer. Had Kramer written his book 50 years earlier, it would have been read only by a very small number of people. However, the printing press made it possible for anyone to influence public opinion on a seismic scale. During the first printing, 150 copies of the Maleficarum appeared in German book fairs. More than 30,000 more followed, sold to local clergy, university libraries, along with mayors and sheriffs. In the century that followed, these local officials wrote Kramer's theories into law, and in the next episode, we will talk about how they were used to murder as many as 60,000 women. That wraps things up for this installment of the Legendarium. If you liked it, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.